Hey guys, welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg. Now, for the last 2 days in two different videos, I have talked about my to-be-read pile for LGBT plus books. So today I thought it would be interesting to do a little bit of a twist on that and talk about some books that are in that genre that I have actually read and would recommend to you. So here we go. I will link the other two videos down below if you're interested in them. But let's get started. I'm going to start with some books I have not really talked about this channel, and then I'm going to build into ones that I already have talked about. And for a couple of the ones I have talked about, I'm just going to do elevator pitches so I can spend a little bit more time on some of the new ones. The first one I want to talk about is actually a play. It's The Normal Heart by Larry Kramer. The version of it that I have actually has The Normal Heart and the sequel that Larry Kramer wrote, which is The Destiny of Me. I absolutely recommend The Normal Heart. I also recommend skipping The Destiny of Me. But we'll get to that. So, I saw the Broadway revival of this a few years back, and it emotionally destroyed me. I am not kidding. I was wrecked. The Normal Heart is about the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and how painfully slow federal reaction was, which of course helped the epidemic get worse. As such, this play covers the full spectrum of emotion from hope to despair, love to loss, pride to shame, and joy to anger. And the anger is really intense in this book, and it should be. The protagonist is a stand-in for Larry Kramer himself. Kramer had a sort of complicated place in the gay community because he was one of its most outspoken activists in a time when being an outspoken activist was not something a lot of people were willing to do, because being out could mean you could be fired from your job and kicked out of your family, and there could be a lot of consequences for it. But at the same time, his frequent unwillingness to compromise when it comes to equal rights had him labeled a sort of killjoy. That is another thing that is really interesting to me about this, because it's also very much about activism, and I can live my life. The most activist I get is that I'm pretty uncompromising about, I have a husband, I will use that word. I won't hide details of my life from other people because I'm worried that they're going to judge me. But I'm able to do those things because people like Larry Kramer existed, so that's another reason this is really interesting to me. But this play is about so many things. It's about getting love and acceptance from your family. It's about the devastating psychological impact of AIDS coming right on the heels of a time when gay people had finally begun claiming their own sexuality and kind of liberating themselves from the closet. It's about science and how bureaucracy can get in the way of progress. It's about love. I could go on and on and on. If this play is ever being performed near you, see it. Barring that, read it. And unfortunately, like as I was saying, The Destiny of Me is it's not great. It feels like Larry Kramer trying to exercise a lot of his own personal demons in a sort of flashy, melodramatic way that does not live up to the greatness and universality of The Normal Heart. Next, we have a book that actually taught me a lesson in a very indirect but profound way. It's Two Boys Kissing by David Levithan. So sometimes you think you're really open and cool, and then something happens that shows you how much work you have left to do. For example, I was at a conference for transgender youth last summer, and one thing that they did was they removed all of the gender designations for the bathrooms. I thought at first, oh, no big deal. But on the second day of the conference, I walked into a bathroom and there were no urinals on the wall. So immediately in my head, I knew this is not the men's room. And in my head, I screamed to myself, it matters. And I backed out of the room as quickly as I could. And I couldn't get past the idea that I was somewhere I shouldn't have been, which was actually a great lesson for me because it taught me how a transgender person feels pretty much every single day. So I had a similar experience with this book, not about gender, but because I found this book at Book Expo. This is an advanced reader's copy of it. David Levithan was there signing books, and I almost didn't get online, even though I had already read The Lover's Dictionary and had wanted to read more books by him. Why did I almost not get online? Because this was on the poster behind him, and I immediately thought when I saw this, I can't be seen walking around with that book. And I'm not proud of that, but that was how I felt. I thought either people were going to find this cover offensive, or they were going to pass judgments on me, or they were going to think I was nuts. And I walked away and then thought, you're being stupid. go back and I got the signed copy, and I'm really glad I did, because as I started, that is actually what this book is about. It's a couple of separated stories that intersect around the central plotline of Harry and Craig, who are two ex-boyfriends who want to break the world's record for longest kiss. And the book is questioning the very thought of, like, what's so offensive about the notion of two boys kissing? They're just kissing. It's just love. And that is exactly what I had been worried about. So this book was constantly, like, pointing at me and saying, hey, you were ashamed of this. Each storyline deals with acceptance and openness, and the book is narrated by a chorus of gay men who died of AIDS, which sounds weird. And there's no denying it's a gimmick. But I would say it works because it puts the history of the gay rights movement alongside the present in a very compelling and, I think, emotional way. By the time I got halfway through the book, I was very proud to be reading this. I didn't care who knew it, so I have always appreciated that lesson. Next is something I don't actually have a copy of, but still recommend. It's The Laramie Project by Maurice Kaufman and the Tectonic Theater Project. So the interesting and really different thing about The Laramie Project is that it's a play that is comprised of hundreds of interviews that the Tectonic Theater Project did in Laramie, Wyoming, following the murder of Matthew Shepard, a young gay man, in 1998. What results is a story of tolerance and intolerance that feels urgent on both a personal and national scale. It's a beautiful portrait of Matthew Shepard from the people who knew and loved him, and it's also an unyielding portrait of how hate crimes happen. It does not condemn anyone, but it does encourage the audience to question how this tragedy happened, if it could happen again, and how we can do better. Incidentally, my foster son was just, they watched a movie of this in his English class, and one of the questions was about why does it matter that they use these interviews as the frame. And what we talked about was how usually if Moishe Kaufman had written a script himself, you would always view the events through the prism of the writer. And what's really unique about this is that you're getting, it's basically just an anthology of other people talking. And because you get to hear them, it feels more urgent. So there you go. That is The Laramie Project. Then there's Aristotle and Dante Discovered the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Alire Sens, and I believe there's actually going to be a sequel to this book, which has me excited, although I don't know how they're going to quite pull that off in the same way. I've mentioned in a couple of recent posts that the YA market is a great place to find inclusive storytelling. I went into this book not knowing what was going to happen. So I don't really want to talk about it too much to you so you could have the same experience. All you need to know is that Aristotle and Dante are two loners when they meet and become friends. They are lonely. One of them is angry. That unexpected friendship teaches them to open up to the world, and it teaches them some important truths about themselves and the kind of people they want to be. It is wonderful. I love it. I cannot recommend it enough. It is fantastic. Then we have The City and the Pillar. In this book, Jim is a handsome, all-American athlete type who feels shy around girls. His best friend, Bob, is a year older than him. When Bob is graduating from high school, the two of them have an unexpected night of passion. Bob thinks of that night as nothing but kind of kid stuff that they're about to move past, but for Jim it begins a personal odyssey that leads to a genuinely shocking conclusion. You see, when Jim graduates a year later, he goes off on his own into the world with the idea of finding Bob, who had signed on with the Merchant Marines. During that odyssey, Jim meets many people, comes to terms with his attraction to men, building up to his relation. He builds up his relationship with Bob to a sort of unrealistic ideal that becomes an obsession for him. And obsessions in books don't usually end well. This is not a happy novel in any sense, but it is a great book and an urgent read about what happens in a time when straying from the traditional path is seen as unacceptable. Now, like The City and the Pillar, James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room is not a happy book. It's about an American man in Paris who finds himself caught between the conventional life that he is striving for and trying very hard to stick to, and the passion he feels for other men. When he meets an Italian bartender named Giovanni, they end up on a collision course with tragedy. We know nothing good is going to happen because we know from the beginning that Giovanni has ended up on death row. And then the book kind of flashes back and forth to tell you what happened. happened for that to be taking place. Pretty much anything James Baldwin writes is incredible, and this book is no exception. Now we start getting into a lot of the ones that I have talked about a lot on the channel. I am going to take a little bit more time to talk about Maurice by E.M. Forster. I've talked about this one a lot because it is without a doubt one of my all-time favorite books. I haven't really discussed the premise much, I don't think, which is kind of surprising though. The premise is actually similar to The City and the Pillar to a point. But for me, this is the one that was much more resonant, even though I liked The City and the Pillar a lot. So as the book opens, Maurice Hall is a university student who begins a discreet relationship with a fellow student of his named Clive Durham. Maurice is hoping that they can find a way to make it work. He's a very romantic character. But Clive, who defines himself as someone who is much more realistic, devastates Maurice by marrying a woman and setting himself on the path of a conventional life at the time. And he encourages Maurice to do the same. And he cautions Maurice that happiness will be completely unavailable to him if he does not. So the main part of the book is Maurice trying to be someone that he is not, and that he knows he is not, thanks to this experience with Clive, and ultimately coming to terms with himself and finding love. I know at least one person has complained to me that they thought the ending was a bit pat and unrealistic, but for me, that was the message I needed at the time I read it. And I think it ties in a lot with Forster's writing, because it's the idea that there are many ways of defining happiness. There isn't just one way to live your life. You can find the happiness you want if you just go for it. And again, to me, at the time I was reading it, that was just a very important message, and it's continued to be really important to me in my life. Now we're going to start getting into some that I've talked about a lot, so I'm just going to do some elevator pitches. The first one is Call Me By Your Name by Andre Aciman. There's a movie adaptation of this. There's a sequel coming out this year, so I feel like, even without me talking at length about it, people are fairly familiar with it by now. My elevator pitch for this is that there's an unexpected romance on a summer holiday in Italy, which leads to a charged, erotic exploration of love, obsessive desire, the burden of expectation, and the power of intimacy. I absolutely recommend this book. This was the first book that my husband recommended to me, and it really earned him a lot of points. The next book I'm going to do an elevator pitch for is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. This is a powerful graphic memoir about Alison Bechdel growing up in a funeral home with a closeted father who may have committed suicide, and how different their lives are. The father being this closeted person, and Alison Bechdel being an out lesbian living her truth. The next one is Full Circle. Now my elevator pitch for this is the writing's not always great, but it is an absolutely wonderful portrait of gay life from 1950 to present. The main character is born in the year 1950, and as he grows up, comes out, and comes to terms with himself, you see the world around him changing, and it is wonderful. I absolutely recommend that. Then we have The Harts, Invisible Furies by John Boyne. My elevator pitch for this is kind of similar to Full Circle. It is about a gay man born in heavily Catholic Ireland, coming to terms with himself, coming out and experiencing the changes in the world around him as Ireland moves from a restrictive Catholic country to a much more progressive country. It is also wickedly funny. I absolutely recommend it. And finally is the book that was my favorite book of 2018, The Great Believers by Rebecca Mackay. My elevator pitch for this is that it tells how trauma has impacted different generations, mostly in terms of the AIDS epidemic in 1980s. It focuses on a character named Yale Tishman in Chicago, and a friend of Yale's closer to the present, who is in Paris where a terrorist attack happens. There is also a character in Yale's timeline who talks a lot about the First World War and the trauma of losing almost a generation of men, even as Yale and his friends are a generation of gay men that are becoming lost themselves. It is a stunning portrait of how trauma can ripple through time, and about love and acceptance, and I would absolutely recommend it. It is also just out in paperback, so if you haven't read it, this is a great time to do it. Those are some of my favorite LGBT plus books. If you have read any of these yourself and have opinions about them, I would love to hear them. If you have recommendations based on these, I would love to hear those as well. And thank you for following along with me on this kind of Pride-related journey of book talking. I'll be back again. Thank you for watching this video. Happy reading.